Have you ever noticed how everyone seems to have a strong opinion about the war between Israel and Palestine? But almost no one truly understands how it all began? Most people just repeat catchphrases, internet memes, or distorted headlines. But what if I told you this story goes way deeper than what you've heard, and that both sides have real reasons to feel pain, fear, and anger? The Holy Land, which should be a symbol of peace, has become the stage for a war that spans generations. But the problem didn't start yesterday. It didn't begin with a bomb or a missile. It began with promises, faith, migration, and political decisions that were, to say the least, disastrous. What looks like just a territorial dispute is actually a web of beliefs, loss, and survival. And the more we ignore that history, the easier it is to fall into shallow judgments. In just 10 minutes, you'll understand why this conflict has dragged on for millennia. No bias, no filter, no sugarcoating, just the facts, explained like we're sitting here face to face. Ready to see this story through a different lens? Ancient roots and biblical legacy. Picture a time when the dust on the roads was as old as humanity's dreams. In the heart of the Middle East, a single family walked toward a promise. Abraham, followed by Isaac and Jacob, set foot on a land that would later be called the Holy Land. Back then it was Canaan, yet that step began a story that, millennia later, would still be a battleground. These biblical names aren't just religious symbols, they were the first to put down roots in what has become one of the world's most complex conflict zones. Over time, the land of Israel came to mean identity, belonging, and faith for the Jewish people. It was there that King David raised his sword and Solomon built a temple that still lives in the collective imagination of millions. We're not talking about fairy tales, we're talking about a people who, despite pain and exile, clung to this soil as if their very souls sprang from it. And, in a way, they did. Every strong nation has a founding myth, and Israel is no exception. But notice, my friend, that even in the earliest days, the Holy Land carried the seed of conflict. Being desired by so many never comes without a price. As the centuries rolled on, this land that once welcomed tribes and prophets would become a prize for empires, kings, and armies. What started with faith and promise was soon tangled with new beliefs, new cultures, and, of course, more war. In our next point, you'll see how these layers stacked up like the pages of a book no one ever finishes reading. Conquests and religious layers. Have you ever stopped to think how one single piece of land can carry so many stories at once? The Holy Land, once the stage of biblical kings, began to change hands so often it would make anyone dizzy. First came the Romans, their banners gleaming in the sun, driven by the ambition to control everything. They didn't just conquer the land, they gave it a new name, Palestine. A symbolic strike meant to erase Jewish identity, like tearing out a page from someone else's diary. But time doesn't stop. And with it came the Arabs. They brought Islam, their mosques, their calls to prayer. Jerusalem, already sacred to the Jews, now became sacred to Muslims too. And the Christians? They weren't about to be left out of this silent war for meaning. The Crusades followed, faith and swords in hand, marching to a city where every stone seemed to hold a promise. It's as if the soil were magnetic. Anyone who steps on it feels the pull to claim something greater than themselves. But this religious multitude, instead of uniting, ended up dividing. Each group saw, and still sees, the Holy Land as the center of its story, as if it belonged solely to one people, one faith, one version of the truth. What was once spiritual turned strategic. What was once sacred became a battlefield. And war, like a virus, spread through the ages. Still, what's remarkable is that even after all this conflict, the Jewish people never stopped gazing back at that land. And in the next chapter of this story, you'll witness the birth of a movement that would attempt to reverse centuries of dispersion. Zionism and the Jewish return. By the late 19th century, as the winds of modernity swept across Europe, an ancient longing began to take on a new shape. The desire to return to the Holy Land. But it wasn't just nostalgia. It was strategy. It was survival. Zionism was born, a political and spiritual movement that aimed to turn memory into reality. Jews were scattered across the world, especially in Eastern Europe, where they faced pogroms, persecution, and the constant burden of being outsiders. It was like living with your suitcase always packed. And no one can carry that weight for generations. The idea behind Zionism was both simple and powerful. If war followed them wherever they went, why not return to where it all began? And so many did, slowly, quietly. They bought land in what was once ancient Israel. They planted, they built, they dreamed. And over time, Jewish communities began to flourish within Ottoman Palestine. Imagine the impact. People who had never set foot there, yet carried that soil in their hearts like a living inheritance. It was like rewriting their destiny with their own hands. This movement gained even more momentum after World War I, when Britain took control of the region. The British mandate over Palestine felt, to the Zionists, like a historic opportunity. It was as if time had finally turned in their favor, at least for a moment. But as you can imagine, in a land so deeply contested, nothing happens without friction. The Jewish return reignited tensions with local Arabs, who saw in it the beginning of a new kind of war, not one fought with swords or crusades, but over identity, territory, and the future. And what came next would only intensify this unfolding struggle. British Mandate and the Nazi era's impact. During the British Mandate, the Holy Land began to look like a powder keg on the verge of blowing up. On one side, the British tried to keep multiple plates spinning. They'd promised support to the Jews through the Balfour Declaration, yet they also wanted to stay in the good graces of the Arabs. The result? No one was happy. Just as danger in Europe was growing like a shadow, Britain started restricting Jewish immigration. And the worst was still to come. The conflict was no longer merely territorial, it had become a matter of sheer survival. As Nazism advanced and the horror of the Holocaust unfolded, millions of Jews were persecuted, deported, and exterminated. At that point, the idea of a safe homeland in the Holy Land stopped being a dream and turned into an urgent necessity. How could anyone trust a world that closed its doors while their brothers and sisters were dragged off to death camps? Entire families fled, many with forged papers, crossing seas and deserts in search of something they weren't even sure still existed. It was like running through a storm, eyes on the horizon and heart in the throat. When World War II ended, Britain could no longer handle the tension. Clashes between Jews and Arabs were boiling over, and London decided to drop the burden. The UN stepped in, proposing to partition Palestine, one part for Jews, another for Arabs. But the Arabs said no. That's when words stopped being enough, and a new war began, a real war with armies, bombs, and mass exodus. It started with a declaration of independence, met immediately by a violent siege, and that's where the next chapter takes shape. The 1948 War and Displacement. On May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders declared the birth of the State of Israel. But barely had the bells of this new nation stopped ringing when the sound of gunfire echoed in their place. The very next day, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq declared war. Yes, war from day one. And it wasn't just against a newly formed country. It was against the idea that the Jewish people, expelled and massacred for centuries, now had a homeland in the Holy Land. Israel held its ground and, in the end, seized more territory than what had been proposed by the UN. A victory marked by blood, loss, and heavy controversy. Amid this conflict, over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from areas now under Israeli control. It's what the Arab world came to call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Imagine being forced to leave your home without knowing if you'll ever return, leaving behind everything, crops, photographs, furniture, history. Many left with nothing but the key to a door they would never open again. And that wound, opened in 1948, still bleeds today, in refugee camps and in stories passed down through generations. But Palestinians weren't the only ones affected. Jews living in Arab countries also faced retaliation and expulsion. In other words, a trait of traumas. Two peoples, each feeling they've lost everything, and both believing, in their own way, that they have the right to the same land. This is the kind of war that doesn't end with a flag raised high. It settles into families, maps, and history books, and in the next chapter, you'll see how another war, shorter but deeply transformative, would forever change the geography and the fate of this region. The 1967 War and Occupations. If you think 6 days isn't enough to rewrite a millennia-long story, think again. In June 1967, Israel faced yet another war against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and in less than a week, not only won, but took control of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Once again, the Holy Land turned into a colossal chessboard of war. The world watched, stunned. How could such a small country defeat so many at once? Yet the most pressing question lingered in the air. What should be done with the millions of Palestinians now living under occupation? No answer came. And that silence became routine. Palestinians were placed under military control, restricted by checkpoints, curfews, and a daily life that, let's be honest, no one would choose. Those who had fled to refugee camps in neighboring countries were barred from returning. Those who stayed saw their land slowly taken bit by bit. A raw sense of injustice spread like dry tinder in scorching heat. The territorial war was morphing into an emotional one, dominating both headlines and the hearts of everyone on the ground. The world tried to mediate. Resolutions were drafted, fiery speeches boomed from the podiums of the United Nations, yet nothing truly changed. Because deep down, this land wasn't just territory, it was the emotional inheritance of two peoples. And when the fight is over more than soil, when it's over the right to exist, everything gets complicated. The war was no longer merely between armies, it was between narratives, between those who believed they were uprooted and those who believed they have returned home. And amid all this, a new generation of Palestinians was born under occupation, ready to fight a very different kind of battle, uprisings and the Oslo Accords. When you live under occupation for decades, fences turn into walls and frustration turns into sparks. That's how the Intifadas were born, Palestinian popular uprisings that showed the world this wasn't just a war between governments, but between ordinary people. Children with stones in their hands stood face to face with tanks in the streets. It was the cry of those who no longer believed in top-down solutions. As those images spread across the globe, so did the pressure for some kind of agreement, anything that might shift the balance even slightly. It was in that tense atmosphere that the Oslo Accords emerged in the 1990s. For the first time, Israeli and Palestinian leaders sat down to try and bring order to the chaos. The West Bank was divided into zones, the Palestinian Authority was created, and there was even a historic handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. Many believed this was the beginning of real peace. But the Holy Land, as always, didn't seem to know how to rest. Jerusalem, the settlements, and the right of return for refugees remained open wounds, and the war, though it no longer had an official name, hadn't ended. Just think of any couple in crisis. If the most delicate issues aren't resolved, silence turns into a ticking time bomb. And that's exactly what happened. Soon violence began to rise again, attacks, military operations, mutual suspicion. The feeling of betrayal took hold on both sides. What once seemed like hope became yet another heartbreak etched into history. And from this stalemate, this atmosphere of resentment, a new force began to rise in Gaza, with a different approach, a different leadership, and, of course, more fuel for the fire. The rise of Hamas and modern escalation. Internal division among the Palestinians themselves became yet another chapter in this long war. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections. It seemed democratic at first, but the split came quickly. With a more radical ideology, Hamas broke away from Fatah and seized control of the Gaza Strip. The result? an almost total blockade by Israel and Egypt. Getting in or out became nearly impossible. Gaza turned into a besieged enclave, and in the middle of it all, the ones who suffered the most were the people. The Holy Land was, once again, a place of despair and resistance. Wars between Israel and Hamas became cyclical. 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021. Attacks, retaliations, widespread destruction, missiles streaking across the sky, sirens screaming in the dead of night, civilians hiding in shelters or beneath the rubble. Fear became routine, like sleeping with one eye open and the other glued to the TV. And despite ceasefires announced with fanfare, peace never lasts. Because what's at stake goes far beyond politics. Its identity, its accumulated pain, its wounded pride, all concentrated in a piece of land the whole world watches, but few truly understand. Today, talking about Israel and Palestine feels like walking on broken glass. Every step risks a cut. And even with modern technologies, diplomacy, and treaties, the tension remains. Because the Holy Land, once a promise of peace for so many, is still trapped in a war with no end. But like every story that still pulses, something is always about to happen. And maybe, just maybe, in the midst of so much loss, there's still a crack where understanding might slip through, even if it begins as a whisper beneath all the noise. Now tell me, how many times have you judged this conflict without knowing even half of the story? Maybe now it's clear that behind every bomb, every border, and every fiery speech, there's a war of narratives, of memories, and of wounds that never really healed. And what's most shocking is realizing that even with all the technology and diplomacy of the modern world, we're still facing the same dilemmas that began thousands of years ago. But what about you? Will you keep watching from a distance, or will you start trying to understand the world with more depth, empathy, and critical thinking? How many other stories are you still carrying around, half told, repeated without question? If this video challenged you, made you reflect, or simply gave you a new perspective, then it was already worth it. And if you want to keep learning through honest, human, no-fluff content, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because we're going to keep digging deep where most people only skim the surface, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.